virtually all humor, especially wordplay, is based on incongruity. There's all kinds of theories and arguments out there, but I think everybody is in agreement that incongruity is the story. Okay, back to chronology. I go to college, I go to grad school, I come to Western in 1966, having never set foot in Washington before, and I'm doing my job. I'm playing in a lab, I'm telling lies to students, and I'm handing out disappointing grades. I mean, that was my job. Otherwise, I kept my nose pretty clean. We had a paper newsletter at that time, and sometimes I'd put in something silly in a letter to the editor. And I very clearly remember having a pun exchange with Maury Schwartz. Some of you old timers might remember Maury. And there was some crazy exchange based upon escargot. I don't know how that happened. And we went back and forth. Anyway, here I am minding my business, and then sometime in the early 1970s, a friend from graduate school urged me to write for Worm Runner's Digest. Okay, so here we go with an excursion. The person who had encouraged me to write for the Digest was named Bob Boyce. And I knew him in grad school. He had an unbelievable work ethic. He was grossly competitive. He was sarcastic. He was thoroughly incorrigible. In grad school, we had fun doing some snotty things now and then. When he contacted me, he was at the University of Missouri. And of course, he was outproducing everybody else in his department. And so his attitude was, you can't criticize me for taking time away from my job to write humor stuff for Worm Runner's Digest. There's no way you can give me any guff on that. Okay. Now, that was then. He underwent a bit of a transformation. And since then, Boyce became an expert on writing. And he became an expert on faculty development. And he wrote a book on how first-year faculty can try to survive. And there have been an incredible number of testimonials as to the advice in his book. In 2015, for example, there was a blog talking about Boyce's wisdom and calling the books cult classics. And so if anybody is having any kind of trouble at all writing, this is the guy to go to. He apparently has excellent information. Did I read his stuff? No. No. Okay, now, write for the Worm Runner's Digest. Yes, as Peter said, guys who run rats are rat runners, and guys who run worms are worm runners. And Worm Runner's Digest was started by a fellow named Jim McConnell. McConnell went to his grad school in Texas, and then he came to the University of Michigan, and he stayed with flatworms, whereas the professor that had overseen his work in Texas said, no more worms for me. He was a remarkable guy. He was curious about med school. He sat through all of med school at the University of Michigan and just abhorred the quality of instruction. He wrote an introductory textbook at the time when introductory texts started to get really big and fat. And before he would allow it to go to print, he wanted to road test it to make sure that it was effective. And he had an interesting tactic in his book. He felt that students remembered examples rather than principles and stuff. So every chapter started off with a story. And this guy was a wonderful story writer. So here was a story. And you'd use that story through the entire chapter to hang the important concepts on so people could remember it well. One of his stories appears in a book called Sci-Fi 1. I think it might be in our library. It's called Psychology and Science Fiction. And it turns out that as any decent science fiction story would be, it's a commentary. It's not a bunch of bug-eyed monsters and blow-em-up warfare. But here is a story, a piece of fiction that communicates really well. All right, McConnell was working on memory and the location of memory. And what he was using were flatworms, these little bitty guys, the inchworm long at the most. And what he would do is he would train these little worms to do something. And one thing that was special about these worms is that they can regenerate. And the worms had a discernible head and a tail. So he would train the worms to do something, and then he'd cut them in half. Now, there was recorded somewhere on this regeneration business, somebody tried to set a world's record by cutting them vertically and ended up with a flat worm that had 1 tail and 10 heads. And so these are pretty hardy little beasties. So anyway, teach the worm something, cut it in half, let the head grow a tail, let the tail grow a head, test to see whether the animal remembered what had been taught. And darned if both sides didn't remember. Both halves showed memory for what they'd been taught. He then tried something even more interesting. He took some flatworms, trained them up, then he ground them up and fed them to naive flatworms. Then he tested those naive flatworms, and darned if they didn't know the stuff that had been taught to the person that they had eaten. Now, one of the things about McConnell is that he really knew how to play the media. He could get publicity for himself. And so these were McConnell's Cannibal Studies. Okay? And if you run with the idea, it's really disturbing. You know, like, Mommy, I don't want to learn the math multiplication tables. Can we eat Grandpa's brain? It's just, it was really, now, the other thing is, not only did he get a lot of publicity for himself with the Cannibal Studies, but he also was a pretty strong advocate of Skinnerian behavior control type stuff. And as a result of that, he became the 10th victim of the Unabomber, because the Unabomber didn't particularly like that kind of stuff. He was disturbed by it. And it turns out that the bomb that was set off did injure one of McConnell's grad students, and McConnell himself ended up with a lifetime hearing loss as a result of the explosion. Now, even though McConnell died in 1990, he had a really clear and a lasting impact. For example, if you go online now, you can find something called the Manual of Psychological Experimentation on Planaria. And you can download it. It's a PDF file, 118 pages. And if you're really interested in a sample of McConnell's writing and the clarity of it, and if you're interested in memory at all, the first 9 pages that he wrote about memory are just crystal clear and really nice. McConnell was serious as could be about science, but not scientists. And he said, quote, anyone who takes himself or his work too seriously is in a perilous state of mental health. Okay. Excuse me. His Worm Runner's Digest started in 1959. And what it turned out to be was kind of an interesting hodgepodge. Because these flatworms were cheap and because he was getting a lot of publicity, all kinds of people were fooling around with flatworms. There were high school kids and so forth. And so part of this thing was like a newsletter, you know, hi, I tried this sort of thing, you know, or I ran into this problem, help me out, that kind of stuff. It also had serious scientific reports. You know, there was honest to goodness studies that were done and written up, but there were also humor articles that were included. And so it ended up to be this kind of conglomerate, this mismatch of real stuff and humor and cartoons and some of McConnell's own science fiction. And so, because a whole bunch of rather hard-nosed people said, this isn't a real journal, we can't cite anything from it, McConnell decided to split it. And so if you remember some of those old 2-in-1 paperbacks, you read through the paperback one thing and then you flip it over and here's another novel going the other way. And that's what he did with Worm Runner's Digest. Worm Runner's Digest remained as the humor journal, but you flip it over and here's Journal of Biological Psychology. Oh, people are happy now. We're willing to cite material coming from biological psychology because that's the real stuff. Okay. Now, he had a lab that was obviously very high morale. And I have a little museum piece. One of the people who worked in his lab was Dr. Margaret Clay. And her niece is local, and she loaned me this sweatshirt from McConnells Lab. And let's just take a look at what's here. At the very top, the coronet is a Hebbian cell assembly. It was the theoretical thought of how neurons are connected to one another. Oopsie, you can see the two-headed planarian with an S and an R for stimulus response type psychology. And then underneath it is a banner. And what the banner reads is ignotum per ignotius. And the translation of that is, when I get through explaining this to you, you'll know less than before. That's pretty good on psychology, okay? Or in other words, explaining the obscure with the obscure. Okay. So, as I say, Boyce encouraged me to write for the Digest. I thought, that sounds like fun. I'm being sufficiently productive, I'm a sufficiently solid citizen, and I also really enjoy putting absurd stuff in my annual report to the dean, because I don't think anybody ever reads that junk anyway. So I started writing for the Digest, and I wrote all kinds of fun things. I even wrote birth announcements for both of my children. I found a student who could draw, and we made up cartoons and stuff. Okay. Back on track. We're up to 1976. It's the bicentennial. What can I do for the bicentennial? Well, when I'm thinking of bicentennial, I'm thinking Ben Franklin. And when Ben Franklin wasn't trying to electrocute himself, or when he wasn't chasing women, he came out with this Poor Richard's Almanac, right? Poor Richard's Almanac. And when you think of Poor Richard's Almanac, what do you think of? You think of these little fussy aphorisms, you know, penny saved is a penny earned and a stitch in time, you know, that kind of stuff. So I thought, hey, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write Poor Richard's abstracts. Okay? Now, just in case there are some serious humanities people here, an abstract is a summary. And it doesn't matter whether it's a summary of a book or a two-page article. It's 100 words of extremely tight writing that includes as much as possible information from the original article. Why it was done, what was done, and so forth. And it also includes the citation information, author, affiliation, title of the article, title of the journal, blah, blah, blah. Well, I frankly went nuts. And so I started writing Poor Richard's abstracts, bogus abstracts of non-existent research, and they all ended in a pun, just like a story pun. But I really pulled out all the stops. I mean, when it came time to put in something about the author, I put in crazy stuff like J.C. Flugel. Now, he's an obscure character from History of Psychology. He wrote the original History of Psychology book. G.C. Grindley. This is a guy who ran chickens, and he had this terribly anthropomorphic statement about having to control for loneliness in the chickens. U. Serletti. I had butchered names of friends. My wife's maiden name shows up in the doggone thing. Warren G. Wonka, if that means anything to you. He was the, like Josiah P. Carberry of Brown. And then for affiliation, I had things like Department of Urban Planning, Central South Dakota State College, or Southeastern Branch Campus of the University of Central Northwest Rhode Island, and Kelm College. For a journal, we had Israeli Journal of Psychology, which read from right to left. Australian Journal of Psychology, which read upside down. The Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology became the Journal of Comparative and Fuzzy Illogical Psychology. Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior became Journal of Vernal Yearnings and Verbal Behavior. Psychology monographs became psychological monographs. The issue numbers and page numbers and all of that stuff were inverted words. In other words, remember, a 3 is an E, a 4 is an H, a 7 is an L. You can take those guys and make words out of them upside down. If you ever play with your little hand calculator, you can have a dandy time. So, I ended up with, so many of these little Poor Richard's abstracts that poor McConnell had to have a part 1 and a part 2. And what happens as a result of doing this, generating these things, I tried to stick to little proverbs and aphorisms to kind of be faithful to Ben Franklin. But what happens is my head ended up with some inertia, and I was generating crazy little puns based on sayings, on cliches, on everything in sight. And so I had a little notebook, and I would be ending up jotting down kernels for possible pun stories. And I would have little slips of paper with those kernels stuffed in it. So I ended up with this crazy collection of stuff. Just sitting there accumulating dust. Now, the abstracts did come out in 1976, but let me take another excursion. A couple of years later, after writing the abstracts, I wrote a Emeritus Digest article called the Lippmannlemma. And you're all aware of those bogus laws of this and that. Okay, well, this was a bogus law, but it's one that explains Murphy's Law and the Peter Principle. And the Lippmannlemma quite simply says, people specialize in their area of greatest personal weakness, greatest personal incompetency. I just wanted to plant this idea, a little take home for you to play with, because I think that it leads to some really nice truths and stereotypes, like indecisive judges, immoral clergy, unlawful cops, and of course psychiatrists are crazy. Okay? And you can also use the lemma to generate some pseudo graffiti, bumper stickers and button type stuff, cheap gags. Outfielders are baseless, geologists and electricians are ungrounded, cardiologists are heartless, internists have no guts. Have a grand time with that. Okay, back to the non-digression. Sometime in the early 1990s, a student, Mara Den, came into my office, and she told me that she knew that I was interested in humor. And she said she was interested in some independent study. Okay, now, this is retrospect, thinking about puns. What are puns? At the minimum, puns are simply a word substitution. Okay? Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. One of the forms of the simplest type of pun is that old gag about, Johnny, can you use this word in a sentence? Okay. And so, for example, Johnny, can you use the word persuading in a sentence? Jack and Jill were married 1 year ago, so they're celebrating their persuading anniversary. Or another one, disclose. Use this sentence, use the word disclose in a sentence. I got all disclosed from Salvation Army. It's just a word substitute, okay? The other, probably the predominant form of the word substitution is the knock-knock joke. And what's funny on knock-knock jokes is the who's there. Most of the knock-knock jokes aren't who. They're not names of people, but they're something else. So let's play some knock-knock jokes. Knock-knock. Yeah. Orange. Aren't you glad you came today? Or knock knock. Yeah. Oswald. Oswald, my chewing gum. You're laughing, you're not supposed to. One more, knock. Althea. Althea later, alligator. Okay. Okay, anyway, there's a whole lot of those things. Now, they don't need to be, the simple word substitutions don't have to be not, these types of form. They can be stories. Let me give you an example of an excellent one of these things, okay? There was a king on a tropical island whose subjects had a ritual of making a special chair for him every year. With the arrival of each new chair, he stored the previous one in the attic of his palace, a typical dwelling made of hay sod with palm fronds for a roof. Eventually, the weight from so many royal stools in the attic was so great that a windstorm caused the entire place to come crashing down, killing the king. The moral of the story? People who live in grass houses shouldn't stow thrones. Okay. Now, I think that that's really a wonderful story, but it really, honestly, is nothing more than word substitution. There's nothing more to it than that. Okay. It does include a Spoonerism, excursion of an excursion. Guys, ready? Okay, what is a Spoonerism? A Spoonerism is a result of William Archibald Spooner, 1844 to 1930. He was a really loved warden at Oxford, but he had this penchant for switching word sounds. And so here's, give me some examples of genuine Spoonerisms, okay? Once Dr. Spooner raised a toast to Her Royal Highness Queen Victoria and proclaimed, 3 cheers for our queer old dean. Okay. Or during World War I, he reassured the students, when our boys come home from France, we will have the hags flung out. And on another occasion, he lionized Britain's farmers as ye noble tons of soil. Okay. And he once referred to a well-oiled bicycle as a well-boiled icicle. Okay. I think these are fun. And when I'm generating grist for pun stories, my first run is to try if I can make a Spoonerism, because I think there's something really elegant about it. But let me give you a little caveat. If you go online and you go looking for Spoonerism, you're liable to find long recitations. And I think they're somewhat terrible. For example, the one that sticks out in my mind is called The 3 Piddle Legs. And it really is the whole story of the 3 little pigs, but it seems like every other sentence has a Spoonerism, but the darn things don't match up right. It's like piddle legs. There's no word piddle, there's no leg. Okay, so I find those recitations to be just maddening, because you're just working your tail off, translating like crazy. Okay. Okie dokie. Now, let me just move along on puns that I think have something a little more to them than just a straight word substitution. Okay. I'm first thinking about Walt Kelly, the creator of the Pogo comic strip. He wrote such things as Deck Us All with Boston Charlie, Walla Walla Wash in Kalamazoo, Nora's Freezing on the Trolley, Swallow Cauliflower Allegaroo. Bunch of nonsense. But I think there's something to it, because what is it? It's a tune, right? It's a Christmas carol, and it has rhythm. So it's not just a raw, naked word substitution, like a knock-knock joke, but there's something a little bit more to it. Okay. Let me give you an example. I tried to see whether I could massage a knock-knock joke to make it a little bit better. So let's try one more knock-knock joke. Knock-knock. Intruder. The burglar came entered her window. See what I'm driving at? There's something a little more there. There's a better connection happening. And so just like the Walt Kelly thing, there's a little more to it than a word substitution. Oh, give me a home between Buffalo and Rome where the beer and the cantaloupe lay. Okay. Word substitution, but it fits something else, so there's something more to it. Norm Crosby, the master of malaprop. Okay. I drink decapitated coffee. Okay, now it's a word substitution, but that word has sensible reference back to the point. I think my girlfriend is stagnant. She hasn't demonstrated in 6 weeks. Okay? And again, there's some sense and logic to it. Other examples can come from the Archie Bunker from All in the Family. Okay. I've got some nice bunkerisms here. Here's Archie. A woman doctor is only good for women's problems, like your groinecology. It's a proven fact that capital punishment is a well-known detergent to crime. I ain't got no respect for no religion where the head guy claims he can't make no mistakes. He's like, what do you call inflammable? All kids are trouble, Edith. I don't want to spend my reclining years trying to raise another one. Okay? So you see, there's something a little bit more rich about those examples. Okay? Now, when going back to Mara showing up in my office and trying to decide what we could do, we ended up finding Tom Swifties. Okay. Let me see if I can find my Tom Swiftie material. Excuse me a second. I don't think I dumped it. Swifties were the result of a fellow named Edward L. Stratemeyer. Stratemeyer had invented an adventure series with where Tom Swift was the main character. He was an inventor, he was a problem solver, he was a detective, he did all. And Stratemeyer also invented the Bobbsey twins, Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys. These were little novels. Stratemeyer had a crew of about 20 hack writers that were churning out this material left and right. And Tom Swift in his stories rarely said something like said, but he said averred, he asserted, but often enough there was a sentence that went blah, 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 said Tom, adverb. And that became kind of a framework pattern. And it became they became spoofs, where the adverb at the end of the sentence related somehow back to the core and the information within the sentence. Now, Mara and I went to the canonical list of Tom Swifties, and the first thing that they included was something that they called a croaker, which is a slightly different form. And there was only one example that was available. It's called, "I'm dying," he croaked. That's kind of cute. And I thought, hey, that's kind of cute. Can I write some too? So I said, "Charlie's the culprit," he squealed. Yummy pastry, she declared. "Tastes just like chicken," he groused. "Convert my British money to US currency," he expounded. Okay. Now, just hearing your responses, some of these took a little longer to fall solve than others. That's fine. Kind of hold that thought. Mara and I decided to use Tom Swifties because Tom Swifties are really easily manipulated. They can be modified nicely. Okay. Now, we have a handout for you to look at where we can take a peek at some of these nice Swifties. Okay. I'd spent some time reading all kinds of cockeyed information. I'd read everything that Gerson Lippman had written. I read 1601 by Mark Twain, which I recommend highly. I'd read all kinds of goofy stuff. And I'd also read a little bit of psychological humor research. And I kept finding occasions where there was confounding, where there were mistakes in the design, so that the results and the information weren't entirely clean and clear. Okay. So Mara and I were going to be really careful, and we weren't going to make that kind of mistake again. Okay. Now, the material on your little handout is copies of stuff from some of the publications that we did. And let me just comment that every single humor study that I've done has been done with student collaborators. And anytime any one of these studies was reported at a conference or was in a publication, these people were always included as co-authors. Okay. Now let's take a look at that first table. And what you see here is the P version is your ordinary garden variety type Swiftie. The carpenter brought the dessert, said Tom piously. That's cute. That's your relationship between dessert and pie. Okay. But then we thought, can we beef this up a little bit? Can we create an additional contextual connection here? And so we now have the priest bringing the dessert, said Tom piously. Aha. And so there's another, the next one's another example of the same thing, pun only, or a pun with beefed up context, and so forth. And our research procedure was invariably simple, but a nuisance, because you have to do nuisance type stuff in this business. And so we ended up with 24 Swifties, and for each sheet of Swifties that a student was asked to read and evaluate, some of them were in each form, and there was all kinds of randomization. And so half the time there would be the with context and half no context and so forth. So after you scramble all of this stuff and then you descramble the data, you end up with pretty clear information. And yeah, our studies were showing that you get enhanced perception of cleverness and coherence and a little beef in humor with the added context. The second table in your handout shows where we try to extend this out a little bit further. And what we had is an X version where there's just nothing going on. And we thought that would be nice for a baseline. And so here is where we will park, said Tom tentatively. There's nothing there. Everything is tentatively there, but there's no relationship at all. The P version is the one that you saw before. This is where we will camp, said Tom tentatively. The C version is where you have some context thrown in, okay? Where you have might and tentative. Are we okay on that? Okay. And then the CT version is the one where we're pulling out all the stops, and of course that's where we have both the context is coherent and you also have a pun. And that study did a nice job. It produced some nice results. Again, the only thing that was a little peculiar was that sometimes the X versions got relatively favorable rating. And the story was, you see, if you were one of the students in the study, 3/4 of the Swifties had something going for them. They either had context, or they had a pun, or they had both, but 1/4 of them had nothing. And so sometimes the students would have some kind of an attitude of, ha ha, you fooled me. I went into this expecting a pun and there wasn't one there, which I think is kind of like a Shaggy Dog story, where you have this enormous build up, and surprise, there's nothing there. Okay, so anyway, we got what we thought was some pretty nice information. And then we started to think there might be something in addition to consider, namely redundancy. I think that if you've tracked what you've been doing in your head with what we've been talking about so far, you'll see that there's been problem solving. That you have something that's in front of you and what's going on here, I have to figure it out, I have to reason it out, okay? I think I can best illustrate this with some gags, okay? Let's take a Rodney Dangerfield gag. He says, "I don't think my parents liked me. My bathtub toys were a toaster and a blender." And you see what you have to do there? The first reaction is, what the heck? Then you start working on it a little bit and say, oh yeah, now I see why. Okay. Here's one I kind of love from Burns and Allen. And of course, Burns and Allen, George Burns is the street man. George says, a funny thing happened to my mother in Cleveland. And Gracie says, I thought you were born in Buffalo. You see what happens? The first part kind of takes you one direction, but then you have to shift gears and figure something out, okay? Now, let's get systematic and let's talk about another gag. This is one of the question and answer two-line types of gags. What do you call a snake that rides around on the front of a car? A windshield viper. Okay. Now, let's see what happens. What do you call a viper that rides around on your car's windshield? You see, that kills it, doesn't it? Okay? There's nothing there. You don't have to put pieces together. Okay? It's just a nothing. Let's consider the other extreme. What do you call a reptile that rides on your car? Windshield viper. That's so remote, you're not going to end up putting the pieces. You have to work too hard to put the pieces together. So what it was looking like was that there's some kind of an interesting relationship where there's some kind of a magical midpoint where you have just the right amount of disparity, you might say. That you don't have redundancy on one hand, you don't have obscurity on the opposite extreme, that there's some lovely midpoint. Now, psychology just abounds in these types of things. The famous inverted U curve, okay? You see that, for example, in any kind of physical performance, if musical performance, sport performance. If you're not sufficiently aroused, you do a lousy job. If you're too aroused, you're going to choke, you're going to make mistakes. So you have this magic midpoint of just perfect amount of arousal. Or you see it in dose-response curves in drugs. Too little drug, it doesn't do anything for you. Too much drug, you're dead. So there's this perfect point where you just have this ideal point where you have just the right amount of something. One of my ex-colleagues likes to talk about this as the Goldilocks effect. You know, it's too hot, too cold, just right. Okay, and so yeah, that's a nice way to think about any of these inverted U's. Okay, so what students and I ended up doing was what you can see on the third table in your little handout, which is just really not easy to interpret. But what you can see in the high redundancy situation, let's take a look on the right side of the high redundancy. I suppose I sometimes like flipping pancakes, said Tom flippantly. Okay, there's just too much redundancy there. The low would be, I like eating pancakes, said Tom flippantly. That's more obscure. But right in the middle, you have cooking flippantly. And that goes together. Okay, that's not as extreme. Now, I don't want to drive you crazy by reading through that completely, but those are just some examples of the material that we ended up using. And we did our same bit, randomizing everything, getting readings from students. And glory be, we were right. The middle level of redundancy or obscurity was ideal. And that's where we got the strongest results. Okay, so what to do next? What to do next is to come full circle. I'd started out with story puns, but we were using these Tom Swifties as our vehicle, or just our materials, our research vehicle for testing out a couple of ideas. And so the question would be, how would context help when you're dealing with a story pun? So I went and I consulted all of those little scraps of paper that I'd stuffed in an envelope and the scribblings that I'd put on a notebook of kernels for pun stories. And I spent 3 or 4 months grinding out an ungodly number of these little pun stories. And not all of them allowed themselves to be manipulated comfortably with and without context, but we found 9 that could be done with, and for one of the studies we only used 6. We didn't want students to have to read too much. It's too hard, okay? So we did the same story here. We took those pun stories with and without added context, and randomized properly, did all that good stuff, handed it out to students, got their ratings, and hooray, okay? It turns out that what we had found about added contextual connection did in fact work. It did in fact enhance the quality of these pun stories. And so if we were to go back to the story about the king with the stowing thrones, it would be really nice if that story could say something about the meaning of the aphorism about living in a glass house, about criticizing stuff of others that you yourself should be criticized for. Okay. So at this point, where does the book come from? Well, turns out that my son, who's an instructor at Pierce College, had been writing math materials for online and open source material. And he'd also been writing math textbooks on Publish on Demand. And I had this ridiculous collection of pun stories that were in just no shape at all. They were all kinds of separate computer files, total mess. But he said, you know, somehow it came up about, wonder if we ought to put those all together. And so he was willing to take care of stuff that would drive me nuts. He was willing to take care of formatting. He was willing to worry about whether the odd numbered pages on the right or the left, cover design and so forth and so on. He could do that. And my wife is also a retired Western faculty, and she happens to be the world's greatest editor. And somehow she had the patience and the forbearance to plow through this ridiculous number of little stories, and she found endless logical and organizational and grammatical problems for me. And so between the two of us and our son, we got the book, and then my daughter, who was recently joined Western's faculty, she got on social media to try to hype the book, okay? And so that's where the book came from. It's just kind of this joint effort and an outcropping, taking those Poor Richard's abstracts, rewriting them to be a story instead of a bogus research report and all these other silly little stories that I'd composed. And the thing that's funny is that there's some strange inertia that happens. When I was preparing for this talk, I ended up cranking out more and more of these kernels for more and more of these crazy little stories and writing gags. And it triggers something. I have no idea what, but something crazy gets triggered, and I ended up churning out this kind of material. Now, I don't know if I should be stopping at this point, or if you'd like to have a couple more examples before we quit. Well, okay. What happens sometimes to me is that somebody will email me, for example, a pun story. And I'll take a look at the pun story the same way I'll look at a Tom Swift and say, missed opportunity, okay? And so I think it comes from too many years of revising students' pre-written work, but I just have to edit, okay? So let me give you an idea of my revision of one of these little stories that came my way. And again, the stories that are in the book, 176 of them, they're all original, okay? It is not a compilation of pun stories that are out there, okay? They're all original. This is public domain. Just like the Stowe Throne story, it's public domain, it's just out there. Okay, here we go. Mary Poppins had an audience with a holy man in India who walked everywhere to the point that the soles of his feet were thick and hard. Mary was quite put off by his thin and frail appearance and very foul breath. On returning to London from her travels, friends asked Mary about her meeting with the venerable master. In her typically upbeat and honest fashion, she replied enthusiastic, supercalifragilistic mystic, hexed with halitosis. Now that's a heck of a pun, okay? That's a heck of a pun. It's dynamite pun. But here's the original version. A holy man in India walked barefoot everywhere to the point that the soles of his feet became quite thick and hard. Due to advanced age and an unwholesome diet, he became quite thin and frail with very foul breath. He was known as a supercalifragilistic mystic hexed with halitosis. How could you have that pun and not have Mary Poppins in there? Okay? It's such a simple correction. Okay? One other one, call it a day. Okay. A conference for players of strategic board games was being held at a gigantic convention hotel. The hotel had an entranceway that opened to a lobby that extended to the top floor. On the ground floor were lots of tables and comfortable chairs for the guests. It was close to Christmas, so there was a tree, decoration, seasonal music over the sound system, and a roaring fire in the fireplace. Scattered throughout that lobby were lots of the conventioneers with the badges, huddled in groups, engaged in exciting conversations that turned out to be each person bragging to the others about some illustrious victory. Clever tactics, deceptive plan, quick checkmate over a highly reputed opponent, and so forth. A bellman was curious what was going on, so he asked the concierge what was going on. His reply, just what you would expect at this time of year. Chestnuts boasting in an open foyer. Okay, now, the original version. A group of chess enthusiasts. See what I'm saying? Don't say chess. My revision avoided that word like the plague. A group of chess enthusiasts had checked into a hotel and were standing in the lobby discussing their recent tournament victories. After about an hour, the manager came out of his office and asked them to disperse. But why, they asked as they moved off? Because, he said, I can't stand chestnuts boasting in an open foyer. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad? Isn't that missed opportunity? Okay. I mean, the name of the tune is the Christmas song, for goodness sakes. If nothing else, for goodness sakes, put Christmas in there, get chess out. And if you'll notice my revision, I did my darndest to avoid the word chess, but I got at it indirectly by talking about checkmate and so forth. If you go back to the story that I told you about the stowing thrones, I didn't have thrones in the body. I didn't have grass hut. I used other words, okay? I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to try to get at that peak where there was some redundancy, but not too little and not too much, okay? So, I hope you've had fun. I hope you've learned something. I hope you go away with some new goofy ideas, the Lippmannlemma included. The book is available here if you want to be an impulse buyer. It's on the bookstore. It's at Village Books. It's at Allied Arts. It's on Amazon. It's on Kindle. Anywhere you want it, you can have it. And people, again, Peter told us a couple of the reviews that I'd never heard of in my life. That's encouraging that they were, the one thing that I run into that's interesting, the gentleman at the Herald read, why can't I think of his name, read the book, and he contacted me a few days later, some days later, and he says, let's get together. There's 5 of them that I don't understand. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Here's this professional writer. And it turns out, and I got this from a trumpet player also, that it depends on your verbal history. Maybe you haven't run into this particular cliche sometime or this crazy aphorism. Okay? So there's that possibility. And another friend of mine doesn't like to just read them, he likes to hear them. And so he and his wife, every evening, he'd read one story to her, and she'd read one story to him. And that's kind of fun, too. Okay. But anyway, I really thank you guys for sitting around here on a nice, bright, sunny day, which isn't wet. And so I really thank you very much for your attendance.